So good morning to everyone and welcome. My name is Laurie Keane-Hart and I'm professor of anthropology and director of the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies. And on behalf of UCLA's International Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's book talk with Olivette Otele, marking the US launch of her extraordinary new book, African Europeans, An Untold History. It's just out this week from Basic Books, Hachette Publishers, and there is a link in the chat with information on the publication. Today's event is part of a year-long series we began to organize last summer, galvanized by the groundbreaking movement for Black lives and the urgent political issues it raises about systemic racism and institutional violence, both in the US and around the world. Given both the global history and the contemporary sweep of racial capitalism, an international perspective is fundamental to both scholarship and activism. Our panels this year have moved widely across global landscapes, from the US to the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and the Pacific, to examine the complex global lives of slavery, segregation, abolition movements, and racial and decolonial liberation movements in the context of Cold War militarism, empire building, and global racial capitalism. The book at the center of our panel today takes a deep plunge into the long record of African Europeans from antiquity to the present in a masterful evocation of individual lives and a brilliant analysis of the historical canvas of social categories and struggles that move and are moved by those lives in the diverse moments and places that have constituted Europe. It's full of surprises for those of us who might have imagined we knew anything about this history. And it's a spectacular final event for our series this year. Thank you all for being here. Before we get to the main event, I wanted to offer a few brief words of acknowledgement and gratitude. First, I wish to note that UCLA, as a land-grant institution, acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielina Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tova and Gar, the Los Angeles Basin, and South Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to those ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. I also want to give our great thanks to International Institute Senior Associate Vice Provost and Director Chris Erickson and Vice Provost Cindy Fan, and to my colleagues on the organizing committee, Jorge Maturano, Robin Derby, Shana Potts, Ipi Kalofonos, Alden Young, Erica Anjum, and the chair of our group, Jennifer Chun. We are, as always, indebted to the excellent staff at the Institute, including Catherine Paul, Peggy McInerney, Kaya Mensoglu, Alex Chu, Oliver Chen, Chloe Huiga, and Stephen Acosta, Liana Grantia, and Sanya Lachan. Finally, I want to thank our generous co-sponsors, the Center for European and Russian Studies, the African Studies Center, and the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. So with that, let me briefly introduce our speakers. You'll find brief summaries and links for reference in the chat box that you can activate at the bottom of your screen. First, our speaker, Olivette Otele, is Professor of History of Slavery and Memory of Enslavement at the University of Bristol. She's a Fellow and a Vice President of the Royal Historical Society. Professor Otele holds a PhD in history from the Université Paris at the Sorbonne in France. Her areas of research are colonial and post-colonial history and the histories of people of African descent. Professor Otele has been the recipient of several national and international research grants. She's also a trustee of the research committee at the Victoria and Albert and Bristol's mayoral chair for the Commission of Racial Equality. She's a regular contributor to the press, television, and radio programs, and her latest books include an edited volume, Post-Conflict Memorialization, Missing Memorials, Absent Bodies, and the book we're hearing about today, African Europeans, that was recently longlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing in 2021. S.A. Smythe is a poet, translator, and Assistant Professor of Black European Cultural Studies, Contemporary Mediterranean Studies, and Black Trans Poetics at UCLA. Their first project is Where Blackness Meets the Sea, on crisis, culture, and the Black Mediterranean. Also forthcoming is their edited special issue, Troubling the Grounds, Global Configurations of Blackness, Nativism, and Indigeneity, and a full volume of poetry titled Proclivity. And our final panelist is Dominic Thomas, Chair of the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at UCLA, and the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of many books, including Black France, Museums in Post-Colonial Europe, Afro-European Cartographies, The Invention of Race, The Colonial Legacy in France, Sex, Race et Colonie, and Visualizing Empire. He has many academic honors in the US and abroad, and has held fellowships, residencies, and visiting professorships in more countries than I can count. He's also European Affairs commentator on CNN. So our format today will include the speaker's presentation, followed by comments from our respondents, followed by moderated discussion and conversation, and Q&A from our audience. We ask that attendees submit their questions on the webinar's Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And you can write your questions in at any point during the session. You can write your questions anonymously or under your name. Although we probably will be limited in time and are sometimes unable to respond to all of the questions we would like, your questions are valuable and will be saved for the speakers. A recording of the event will also be posted on the International Institute's website. So now let me invite our speaker, Professor Olivette Otele, to our virtual podium. Olivette. Oh, we need to unmute.
It was bound to happen just at least once. Thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be there. I would have, of course, loved to be there in person, but maybe another time. I wanted to walk you through my book by looking at each chapter, and we probably won't have time for this. But I also wanted to walk you through to the kind of process, what led me to writing the book, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to start by the end, which is about, the last thing I did was basically write the end of my introduction. And the end of my introduction was angry, uncomfortable, and hopeful. Because following the killing of African-American George Floyd in May last year, well, we saw mass demonstrations across the globe in protest. And protests were about a lot of things, but about the power of the police as an organization that represented citizens, an organization that is supposed to protect the citizens, and yet that appears to continue to fail them over and over. So we saw terms such as police brutality, systemic racism, or institutionalized racism. They became at the forefront of the debate, particularly in Europe. And these terms were not born in a vacuum, as we know. They are directly related to a series of events that shaped contemporary Europe. And that history dates back to centuries and have its origins in colonial conquest. However, the reason why I decided to write the book on those histories, the histories of African Europeans, that histories that span over 20 centuries and runs across roughly 4 continents, is not really or only about colonization, but it is about trajectories, identities, encounters, resilience, liberation. It is about claiming one's space as an African European in the African and European history, in the African and European literary, geographic, social science, political, art books. So it is about the stories that were not taught to me as at school, but that existed and were circulating around me as a child born in Africa, in Cameroon, and as a child of the French Republic. The stories of a kind of greatness of Ethiopia, Egypt, the Kingdom of Mali, and the pain that resulted from German, British, and French colonizations were stories embedded into my personal trajectories. These stories were all metaphorically, literally, collective sites of memory and history that shaped my education and also, of course, my intellectual journey. So for my book, I thought I'll start with Ethiopia. I had the amazing opportunities for many years. After many years of commuting from Wales to Paris, Wales in the UK and to Paris, where I managed to secure a permanent job to teach and research, I managed after so many years to secure a job in the UK. Some of you, and in the city of Bath, and some of you may not know the city of Bath, but for those who know a bit more, well, Bath is known for its connection with Jane Austen novels. It's known for its connections with British period drama and series. It is the city that has a Roman legacy, but also it is a city that is often presented as quintessentially English. So I taught in Bath for 6 years and found that there was another history that existed in the city. And Bath was the place where Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie resided for many years after the fascist Italian army's invasion of Ethiopia in 1936. It is therefore, it really seemed suitable for me to start the book there and to go back in time as a kind of homage. And in particular, to go back to the Kushite and to the Ethiopian queens, the Candaces, and how they resisted Roman invasion from the 27th century BC onwards. So I talk about Amarineras and other kind of key characters, but what was important for me to talk about was the Candace as the mother of the king. So this is how they're defined. They're defined as the mothers of the kings. But these women were really warrior queens and absolutely skillful diplomats. So the story I wanted to talk about and to tell through them was a story of the narration of power, a narrative of resilience and compromise. For me, these stories have been taught to me by my grandmother, not in great detail, but she's heard about the Candaces. And for me, these stories were very important because they were examples of what I would call early Black feminists in so many ways. Of course, the Candaces were not alone. We also have stories of the Meroe queens, Meroe being roughly what we would call nowadays Sudan. And we heard about, well, I heard as a child about these queens and how their stories shaped Sudan and Egypt. And I heard about them as a teenager by reading Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, who talks about the Black origin of Egypt. And these stories are, again, about resistance, power, colonization. But what was interesting for me about the Meroe queens, the Candaces, was these stories rarely put women at the forefront. And they talk about colonization. It's a bit as if the history of colonization was erasing the gender dynamics, only to see gender dynamics in terms of kind of sexual violence, not necessarily in terms of power and power held by women in certain situations. And in these stories as well, we see Africa appearing and presented in a certain way. Africa is the place of otherness. It's geographical otherness rather than the melanin otherness. You have other markers of otherness, and these other markers are equally important in early days. And I'm thinking about the construction of otherness through religion. And it was important for me, again, to look at the construction of otherness that function outside the skin color. Religion and the narrative of Arabs versus Christians is linked, of course, to the Arab occupation of the Iberian Peninsula in 700 and the Arabian hegemony in the trade in human beings. Again, when we think about the trade in human beings, you talk about the Arab trade or the Arab slave trade, almost as opposed to in opposition to the transatlantic slave trade or Indian Ocean slave trade. But what was interesting for me was to look at the kind of economic dimension that is prevalent rather than the dynamics of again, gradations of power. So from the Arabs, we we learn and we see how Christianity started to denigrate the Arabs by naming them Saracens, by naming them the impure, and so on and so forth. And that otherness, that construction of otherness, is not necessarily based on physical attributes. As I said, it's really a religious one. So you started to have a kind of an idea emerging about visible or invisible differences. And things seems clear or at least clearer. But again, I wanted to challenge that a bit and interrogate these boundaries, geographical boundaries, racial boundaries, but religious boundaries, and look at another category of people. And these people were the Mamluks of Egypt. Now, some of you might not know about them. Some of you obviously do. So we have the slave trade in Eastern Europe, and that slave trade was basically based on the traffic of children. Those children were taken into slavery, sent across Europe, but more importantly, sent to Egypt. And those children, over time, through several centuries, became a class on their own. So they were raised as soldiers, and they were allowed to marry only amongst themselves. So other children trafficked, women this time, and trafficked and sent to Egypt. So marrying amongst themselves. And so you have a category of people who are based in Egypt, therefore in Africa, and who are of European descent, therefore white, who are Africans, and who are Muslims. So otherness worked in different ways. And I wanted to talk about them because I wanted to, again, trouble the boundaries of what it means to be an African and what it means to be a European. And in terms of period, we're talking about 900 of our time, and they were in existence for over 1,000 years. And the Mamluk acquired power, and some of them became monarchs and reigned over Egypt. So what this tells us is that the history that we know today about Europeans is much, much more complex than skin tones. And we need to, reevaluate how we define Africans and how we define Europeans because of that legacy, that historical legacy. So speaking of traveling and speaking of traveling boundaries, what about another man? What about Saint Maurice? Saint Maurice was a Theban soldier, meaning he was an Egyptian soldier who was, and at the time, Egypt was under Roman rule, and he refused to obey the orders given by Rome by going to war, and he was killed. And Saint Maurice became a martyr, a legendary character. And what is interesting for me is that he moves from kind of the confines of Africa to Rome, but it's not really in Rome that his reputation is made. It is precisely made further north in Magdeburg, which is nowadays Germany, where in the 13th century, a cathedral commissioned a statue of Saint Maurice. So you have this Black man proudly standing there before the cathedral and symbolizing Christianity, symbolizing resilience and power. This African, who is supposed to be the other, is becoming the symbol of survival, and this not just survival, more than that, a symbol of power. So we have here, beyond the color, the significance of the legacies of the past. I was trying to unpack how it had been possible, given the kind of historical context at the time, and so on and so forth. But Maurice is not the only one who is along the Mediterranean seen as an important character. Another character, and this one is much more, much well known, but he's not known because he was an African. He's not known because, he conceded and he's a symbol of resilience. No, not at all. And it's Septimius Severus. Septimius Severus, Roman emperor, ruthless, like most Roman emperors were, is somebody who was born in nowadays Libya and from an elite family. And he's going to travel to Rome, have that, kind of Roman education, Latin, Greek, and all that, and have this very elite education, make his way. And he's ever so clever, ever so well calculating as well, that he's going to impress around him. But by the age of 25, he's having kind of very high skilled civil servant duties, and he's sent across the Roman Empire. But it's not enough for him. He wants more power, and he is going to succeed because he was somebody who was a military leader, but also a very skillful diplomat. And so much so that he became a Roman emperor. As I said, like most Roman emperor, he wants more. He wants conquest. He's thriving on blood and on expansion. And he's going to go on the campaign of Britannia. And, it works more or less well. He's having troubles with his children. He might have been one of the greatest Roman emperor in terms of, when I say greatest, in terms of ruthlessness. He was a terrible father, and his children are just these horrible, debauched people who try actually to assassinate him. Long story short, he ends up in the north of England, conquered Britannia, part of it, and then becomes ill and dies in York. Now, this is an extraordinary story because he dies in York, and York is, just like Bath, one of the most quintessentially English city in Britain. And if people in York know about Septimius Severus, very few people are taught about his African origins. Very few people can tell you where he came from, even though at the British Museum, for example, you'll find he's African. He looks like a Roman, but he's a Mediterranean, so he is of mixed descent. And I find this story quite fascinating because it tells me the ways in which the narrative of conquest is presented, the ways in which racialization before its time actually functioned. It means that the Roman Empire had less difficulty accepting others in terms of skin color. It was about power. It was about who succeeds, who gets ahead, and who manages to kind of climb the ladders, rather than about one's origins. Having said that, that origin actually serves the purpose of some others, African Europeans. And I'm thinking about the intellectual Fronto, who is a skilled man and who has had the privilege of becoming the tutor of several emperors, Roman emperors, and who is actually linked to others, many other African Europeans. And suddenly, by examining that story, I found out that there was actually a whole network in ancient Rome, a whole network of African Europeans who were well recognized, celebrated, and who were circulating around European capitals, traveling along the Mediterranean, but also further north, and welcomed and supported, not as isolated guests, but actually as powerhouses of knowledge. And that story led me to kind of look at furthermore at the idea of Black Mediterraneans. Now, the term Black Mediterraneans is just a play on words, because the term itself is borrowed from scholar Alexandra Di Maggio. And Alexandra when she talks about the Black Mediterranean, she talks about contemporary Black migrants who are crossing and dying in the Mediterranean. So I wanted to show that there used to be a different kind of Black Mediterraneans. And I decided to look at those prominent names. So in a way, my trajectory here is about exceptional characters. However, this idea of exceptionalism, we might discuss that later. It's a double-edged sword, and we'll talk about that later. So those exceptionals, we have, of course, the fascinating figure of Alexandre de Medici, who was Pope Clement VII's nephew. Some have argued that he might have been his son, but we don't know about this. Officially, he was the nephew. And Alessandro became the first Duke of Florence, I think at the age of 19. And what is special about Alessandro is that he was of dual heritage. His mother is said to have been of African descent, and his father, of course, of Roman or Italian descent. What is interesting for me, what was interesting, not so much about his life, but how the narrative about his life has been transformed across time and space. 15th century Florence was all about class. So even though he was, well, he seemed to have been quite unpleasant. Some people would say in today's term that he might have been a sexual predator. It seems that he was protected by his class, but also people were frowning, his reputation was frowned upon because he seemed to not having been disturbed by the fact that he ruined certain women's reputation in Florence. What is interesting about this is that the question of color, skin tone, and all the rest of it was not the topic of 15th century Florence. What was the topic was, of course, his reputation and the class divide. So over centuries, he became that figure of, some people contested that he was actually Black. Others said that his mother was probably Italian, and these are all lies. And you have scholars actually writing books about this. And what is interesting is to see that even his representation in painting has changed. So he moved from this curly hair, dual heritage person into somebody whose skin is lighter and lighter and lighter, because Blackness becomes a stigma as Europe delved more and more into colonial conquest and into slavery. Still, if we're going to look at class divides, let's look at somebody else who is prominent, who is in some ways at the bottom of the social ladder. And I'm thinking about one Latino, the kind of a grammarian who was born, who lived in Granada. He was enslaved, which is extraordinary because this is the story of somebody who was extraordinarily intelligent, and so much so that he's going to be given more education, more privileges, and who would go to work, teach in one of the most prestigious institutions in Granada, while still remaining an enslaved person. He had the protection and the backing of the King of Spain, and he produced extraordinary literary canons. He wrote, for example, Austria-Carmen, and Austria-Carmen, is never taught in school, actually. And I check, it's not really taught in Spain either, or even at university level in the rest of Europe. And yet the man was an extraordinary powerhouse of his time in the 16th century Granada. He talks about the Battle of Lepanto, which is a battle that took place between the empire, the Ottoman Empire and Spain. And the battle resulted in the victory of Spain, but very subtly, Juan Latino managed to explain, while retaining the kind of support of those Spanish elites, managed to explain very subtly that what they were doing at the time with the subjugation and the discrimination against Moriscos was terrible. Moriscos were Muslim populations who had been forced to convert to Christianity. So these people were constantly guarded. They were set in, they couldn't live wherever they wanted. They were basically put in kind of reservation, and they were monitored constantly. So very certainly the poem is about people's place in this place of culture, of beauty, and how actually Catholic principles and humanist principles are really at odds with what was happening at kind of a social socially, really, in society. And that was so important, the ways in which he did it, so subtle and so beautiful, that scholar Flá Molinero talks about him, when he talks about him, mentions the fact that for him, Juan Latino was a Renaissance humanist, and that is beautiful. And you don't hear about Black Renaissance humanists. You hear about other people. That story, again, is not really widely taught. What is taught is about his differences and all that, but not his production as an academic, really. Black presence seemed to be disturbing for a 16th century Europe. So it was disturbing, it was feared. So, and it needed to be represented. You see more and more in 16th century European capitals, you see more and more enslaved people. You see more and more fear towards enslaved people. They are subjugated by law, and yet they represent a menace, they represent the unknown, even when they are Christianized. So they are feared, and you have that actually crystallized in the play Othello. Othello is a Muslim. He's got like a double scar. He's a Muslim and he's a Black man. So that, the ending had to be tragic, tragedy, and he had to die. But those populations are also mocked. And we see the more and more plays being set up and created. And for example, you have the plays written by Lope de Rueda, and his use of Black speech to ridicule the Black population. And you also see in Cervantes' play, you see Cervantes' ambiguous mention of Juan Latino in Don Quixote. All this showed you that there's certain kind of racial anxiety, as we would call it nowadays, that is really troubling societies at the time. Blackness is feared in the 16th and 17th century, but Blackness is redeemable through Christianity and conversion. Blackness is also organized. So you have parallel stories, 15th, 16th century, feared and all that. But you also have what are called pockets of resistance, because 15th century Europe, and in particular, 15th century Portugal, you have Blackness organizing itself. You have enslaved people organizing themselves into early confraternities in Portugal. And noticeably, one of the earliest ones is set up in 1471. And these people do not call themselves Europeans, they call themselves Africans. They are accepting their condition in the sense that they are enslaved. But these confraternities are there to provide support for people who join them. They're there to provide information, because some of these populations are displaced in the Americas and are sent there. So it's the early examples, for me at least, of organizing, of Black organization at the time. So if we move further a bit more, so I kept mentioning the slave trade, and really the elephant in the room is indeed the slave trade, and how the slave trade further shaped the notion of otherness and clearly defined Blackness and whiteness by putting hierarchy in place. And that hierarchy led to what we know nowadays, or we understood nowadays as white supremacy. So for me, it was about looking at different levels of organization of Black supremacy, the rhetoric, the words, the action, the legal side, the cultural side, through art, through music, and so on and so forth. So it is about the foundation of the invention of race. If in previous centuries, racialization was religious, Christian versus Muslims, geographical, Irish versus English. What I mean by that is that Ireland and England quite close, and yet in the 15th century, earlier, even in the 14th century, 15th century, you have the Irish seeing, the English seeing the Irish as another race. In the 17th century, by the 17th century, it was almost exclusively based on skin tone and skin color. So we have a shaping or changes in the discourse at the time in the 17th, but also in the 18th century. And I wanted to see what it meant to be an African European and whose self-worth was based on that racialization and those premises. And again, I wanted to look at exceptional individuals simply because I wanted to contrast them with ordinary people. We have less information about ordinary people, but we do have some, and I'll come back to that later. And I chose to talk about Jacobus Kapitein in the Netherlands. And his story is an incredible story. This is somebody who was kidnapped, sold to a sea captain, a Dutch sea captain, ended up in the Netherlands, in Holland, ended up because he was taken when he was 8 or 9 or maybe 10. He became a bit of the child of the family, if you would. So he was taken by the sea captain, and the sea captain decided to give him to somebody else who was a scholar. And he had this extraordinary education, taught Latin, Greek, and all the rest of it. Did a dissertation that he presented to before an audience of European scholars, and of course, high praises and etc. What is interesting, though, it was a dissertation on theology. And what is interesting is that his dissertation was about slavery. I'm kind of reducing his work here, and I shouldn't do that. But basically, the premises were that slavery wasn't when we are alive wasn't that bad, simply because redemption comes, when we die. In other words, there are two worlds, and we shouldn't be, too put up by the carnal world and the world in which we were living right in the middle of the 18th century. So subsequent scholars have completely discarded him, saying, well, he was a racist and he supported slavery. It's for me, we need to look at it very closely, because this is a man who was taken as a child, who evolved in a very elite circle, who might have seen Black people, but those people were not like him. In other words, he was taught that he was not like them. He was different. He wasn't quite white, but he wasn't quite Black. And he was extraordinary and intelligent, and he was taught and told that all the time. And so much so that they managed to convince him that he should go back to Africa and educate his population. And very gladly he went there, and he's supported by the Netherlands. But once he get there, he found out that there's a population of white men who are sailors, who are uneducated, and who are behaving in a certain way. They're behaving like slave traders towards Black people. He's taken aback. They have no respect for him. They're mocking him. So he decided, almost as if he found out that he was actually Black. So he took matter into his own hand and decided to educate the dual heritage population, and in particular condemn the fact that some of those people would have children but not provide anything for those children and leave them behind, not education, but no financial support. So, but that is frowned upon, so much so that eventually the Netherlands is going to kind of let him go. So he dies completely in debt, and his reputation ruined by several people. They accusing him of misappropriating finance, but really he didn't receive much to be misappropriating any finance. A long story short, he died poor. He died poor, but the interesting fact is that he found out that there was another reality about the slave trade and slavery, and he lived it. So he's of dual heritage, not in because of his skin, but he's dual. He has a dual cultural heritage because he's both African, born in Africa, but also European. And this idea of dual heritage is not, again, only based on skin tone, but I wanted to look at that as well, because we talk about dual heritage people who are born in Europe. What about those who were born in Africa? And I was absolutely fascinated by the story of Ga women in Ghana. Ga women were women, generations of women who tended to marry Danish slave traders and Danish traders. And those women belong to a class of people. So you have the Ga population and the community that is very patriarchal in the sense that women had very little rights. But the patriarchy wanted these women to marry, well, they're not really married. They have an arrangement that is kind of like a marriage, to live with these men, and to, the proximity to whiteness allow them certain economic advantages. But it was much more than that. The Danish needed these population to be able to have access to resources in Africa. So these people, these populations were intermediaries. And what I wanted to demonstrate is how these women are managing to carve a place in society and kind of escape patriarchy while providing and securing a future for their children. Because in Ga society, men and women were not allowed to live together. Well, these women are going to force the Danish not to live with them, protecting, raising their children. And once their children are in their teenage years, send them, if they were male, send them to the fort managed by the Danish, and to have an education. And according to Danish laws, if you had children, you had to give, well, the mothers an allowance, but you also had to protect the children by leaving them something. So I looked at the work done by Hilary Jones about Ga women, but I also wanted to contrast that with something else that was happening in Francophone Africa, which was about the Signard in Senegal, in Saint-Louis, in Gorée Island. The Signard had another arrangement, which was like a proper marriage, which was mariage à la mode. And what was interesting for me to look at is how this category of people is not just a community proximity to whiteness, they're actually dictating the terms of the exchanges. These women became so powerful that they are slave traders themselves. They are ordering fabrics from across Europe, coming from Asia. They are cultural icons and fashion icons, but they are, as I said, also slave traders and dictating the terms. So things are tumbling when France abolished the slave trade and doesn't apply the same law to Senegal. These women had to reinvent, women and men had to reinvent themselves, but at that point, many of them actually had kind of positions in the social ladder, in government, and so on and so forth. So I looked at those stories. Again, it's about dual heritage, but none of these women, the Ga women, were defending fiercely their African identity. The women of Senegal and the men of Senegal, the Signard, were defending their dual heritage identity. And that dual heritage was born on wealth acquired over centuries. Those stories allow me to look at, for example, Denmark and the ways in which Denmark was dealing with that past, because that past until the 2000s was not taught to the rest of the Danish population. It's a past that existed, and therefore communities in Saint Croix, for example, Dutch Caribbean, knew about these stories. People of African descent have known about these stories. Enslaved people, or the descendant of enslaved, have known about these stories. But these stories were not integrated into European historical narrative. And in the year 2000s, after decades, if not centuries, of kind of organization and kind of activism, these stories were completely burst open. And the dialogue started, a dialogue that is still violent to this day, and that is about Denmark participation in the slave trade. Because when you talk about the slave trade, you hear about the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French. the Dutch, and so on and so forth. Very rarely do you hear about this Scandinavians' participation in the slave trade. I'm checking the time at right now, and I'm still good. I have like 3 minutes. Perhaps I should conclude. I wanted to talk to you about Germany and Brandenburg, because Germany, I was born in Cameroon, and we have a family history that is very much linked to Germany. And I wanted to tell you about the construction of a historical narrative that is based on amnesia, but also on ruthlessness and the notion of conquest and so on and so forth. But, you know, we can talk about that later. I'm just going to perhaps, perhaps move to the conclusion, which is that all these stories are constantly back and forth. I'm constantly looking at past and present because it's important for me. I'm looking at them as a scholar, but I'm also looking at them as a child of Africa and a child of Europe, and how erasure, amnesia, is actually a construction of power, and how these dynamics are obliterating generations of activism and fight, but never completely. Because there's something that gave me so much hope by looking at these stories, is how all the time, all these populations have found what I call pockets of resistance, and little by little are forcing 21st century Europe to talk about these questions and this, and it's kind of try and address this nostalgia for the time past, when those times were a source of trauma for so many people and citizens, forcing the governments to try and see, try and look at the gaps. For example, we're talking about multicultural Europe. What does it mean? What about political representation? Where is the power? Who holds the power and for how long? Is it sustainable to still talk about pure Europe, kind of white Europe? It's not the reality that I know, and it's not the reality that these younger generations are fighting for. Yes, that's exactly 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Otele, for putting us in the picture and providing us with some evocative examples of the individuals that you have peopled your book with. I think we'll now turn to Professor Smythe for some comments.
Brilliant, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay. Wow, that was incredible and well-timed, both in the sense of your talk and also the really timely implications of this book and its US book launch. So first, I just wanted to say congratulations. No one has showed the book. Maybe I'll hide my little post-it notes there just for the visual, but it's here, we have it. Okay, so I'm just going to offer a couple of things. I initially had presented some questions, but I know that it's meant to be sort of conversational. So rather than sort of re-rehearse the deep impacts of your book, because you've traced it out chapter by chapter for us, I thought I would just offer a few things. And I did say I was going to gush a little, but I'm curbing it now. I'm like centering myself. But I did, just be a bit cheeky, but I did want to say, you talked to us about exceptionalism in a really comprehensive and evocative way. Two things I wish to say about that. One, as you're taking this very comprehensive, I'm going to say that word too many times, sort of historiographical analysis from the classical era to the present day, it really is 20 centuries in this amount. So it really is incredibly vast and extensive. And despite the sort of length, when you think of a 20 century long historical intervention, it still really gets to the heart through the sort of narrative refraction that you offer us in terms of refraction in the, like photographic sense, in terms of taking us from broad historical scope to individual story, but also refractive in a historical sense of, giving us, starting with the Ethiopians, but sort of like moving back and forth through time to show the through line of the narrative of African Europeans. Paul Gilroy obviously has talked to us about, quite famously, about what it means from the Black Atlantic to relegate the story of Black peoples to the present, but you also show us the underside of that in a really powerful way, showing the narrative of exceptionalism. Why I wanted to dwell on that is because, as you've talked to us about today, you go through and talk to us about the sort of pitfalls of the underside, the duality even of this kind of exceptionalism. But I did also want to just, I guess, uplift, and hopefully not an embarrassing way, because you already know the numbers, right? That in the United Kingdom today, in 2021, where we are, there are, I've written it down, approximately 21,000 people titled to academic staff. 0.7% of those people are of African descent. If you want to include it, Black in terms of political Blackness, which we can certainly talk about, that number goes up to 2.5%. So if that's what makes us feel better, we can think through that. But so we're talking about exceptionalism through this historiographical lens. And we also have Professor Otele here, who is being the first Black woman appointed to a professorial chair in history, also being an exception, but also resisting that narrative by really claiming and garnering the roots in what becomes then a really African European story, right? I'm just saying this because Professor Otele is not in the book, but is certainly of the book in a way that I personally find moving. My comrades in the United Kingdom find incredibly moving, to have this kind of storied activism through scholarship, but also in this embodied feminist way, is really incredibly meaningful. And, for the UK, a shame. So I did just want to say that here, because, and this is what I would love to, one of the things I'd love to talk to you about today, is that you did say, you see what the people now think about it in current generations. So I'm assuming that includes mine, and certainly after, just where a lot of us have had to come, since I'm on Tongva land and in the United States, have had to come to the United States to learn the history and reflect it back to Britain. So by talking to us about African Europeans in a very capacious way that does not, it actually does not really allow for a certain political positioning that academics are actually, prone to do, which is sort of lay a political claim and label, sort of say that's what it is, and then reify the very groups that we're trying to attend to and offer nuance to. And so terms might include like Black Europeans or Afro-European or Afro-European, and these sorts of different and shifting nomenclature that sort of, nobody I know on the ground, nobody I know in the UK calls himself an Afro-European, and yet I read pieces every day about Afro-Europeans, even though, a Black British person wrote a book, who I know, Johnny Pitt wrote a book on Afro-Europeans, but, that's still not quite, that's still not quite the container of our organization identification, right? And Stuart Hall, of course, told us about identifications, not identity. And so it really is politically powerful for this text to be talking about African Europeans, and as Professor Otele has said, thinking with us through this vast historical period about the geographical rather than ethno-racial attachments that sort of bring us into conversation, bring us into relation in a way that involves, of course, subordination, but doesn't have to dwell there. And I mentioned subordination to segue a bit into the very cheeky title of Black Mediterraneans, because that is, of course, the area that I study. And this sort of understanding that subordination is not the only dynamic, it's not the what is this? It's not the only cudgel through which Black presences, African presences, have been made manifest and can be felt in the place that we're calling Europe and the place that we're calling Africa. And a space like the Mediterranean, I say calling because these geographies shift, their identification shift, the nomenclature also shifts, and the chapter 2 or 3 that talks about the Black Mediterraneans is a very useful one in sort of thinking through, again, I call it this refractive lens, this refractive reading between what are now nation states, between geographical regions, but also in terms of identification through the land and how that becomes racialized through something like transatlantic slavery and other forms of racialized or racializable subordination. But what existed, what preceded that moment is also still constantly emerging, and we can actually return to that without either what Sylvia Wynter talks to us about as mistaking the map for the territory, but also mistaking the forest for the trees. 2 ecological metaphors that I didn't fully think through, but so that we don't have to have a unified lens and corral ourselves under it, because that might actually do a disservice, is one of the things I've learned through this text, and helps actually reify and undermine any actual chance of identificatory liberation, which Professor Otele talks to us about in the later chapters. I'm speaking pretty quickly because I'm nervous, and also because I don't know how much time I have. So I'm going to slow down my speaking and say just 2 more things. I mean, it really is just a lot to cover, but I also don't need to sort of be comprehensive, because the text does that and it's available for purchase. Yes, so I already started talking about this actually out the gate, but one of a second question to land on, and then I have one more after this, is about the title or the subtitle, which is An Untold History. And I actually would love it if we could talk a bit about more about Untold for whom, since we've already said, on an intellectual or like a scholastic academic level, right? Many Black European, many African Europeans, many Black Afro-descended people from Europe or linked with Europe in some way have come to the US in order to learn their own histories. But that prism, where it could actually offer us a space of transnational or internationalist, I don't want to like miss one for the other, internationalism is still radically and politically important, that we sort of reemerge in a different form of power relations that it would be great to talk about today. And I think this text also opens up, right? So if we're thinking about African Europeans and their concerns and the swath not just being in and of Europe, but also in and of Africa and the relations operating in that way, and that opens up so much for well, I would say Black people to hail the sort of political marker, but also Afro-descended people on a global scale, so that we can actually understand in a way that, you know, many other interventions have offered us many different kinds of points of entry, but that we can actually understand the possibilities that come with contact. Absolutely, and certainly through racial subordination, absolutely through, you know, dehumanization. But what is really sort of telling to me is the way that we think about denigration, a term that I use intentionally, and I'm learning about from Professor Otele as well, to think intentionally and not the way that we may hear about it in the mainstream, which is somewhat of a pet peeve. You know, when people talk about, you know, I was denigrated here, and they mean insulted, it actually means that things are being blackened, and we can actually think about the racialization inherent in the language that we use. But what about actual, you know, etymological denigration, like the blackening of certain figures and people and geographies through time and space? We can actually think more about what kind of affinities and affiliations are possible, and what kind of political liberatory sites of possibility can be held in that wake. And so, yes, Untold for whom, specifically because you go through so many geographic historic periods, you know, maybe you could speak a bit about, pardon, what you know, the encounters you've had with the text, because we're around the US book launches, I imagine, but you know, was published in December 2019 elsewhere. And so you've had maybe a year or so, even though it's been a pandemic year, so no worries if not, but you know, how it's been taken up in terms of the insistence on bringing together these different points of contact, these different sites of what you cite someone else, you know, is talking about like Africanity, or these different African European sites of encounter, how those have been received. Because we know, for example, about Alessandro de' Medici, but of course we do, because he has been exceptionalized. So even an Italian who doesn't think that, you know, Italy colonized anything, which is a very common and mainstream assumption, even today, they will say, ah, well, we did have, you know, here's one, right? But then you'll talk to them about Brandenburg, or you'll then talk to them about Prussia, and they'll say, you know, they'll have no idea, or perhaps vice versa. Right, and certainly when it comes to the UK, I personally, I didn't learn any of it. So you know, I definitely had to find out elsewhere through, you know, other kinds of oral cultures, and actually leaving the UK. The last note that I wanted to ask, one thing that I wanted to state was, when you started talking to us about Bath and its, you know, quintessential Britishness. And you gave something very evocative, which is, you know, how you entered into our conversation today, but also into the book. It sounded like, you know, you were occasioned to think about the life underneath that city. And so I guess I just wanted to throw this out for the audience, that what also is here and was woven through in Professor Otele's book talk today was another kind of underneath that has to do with gendered history, feminist history, because we also have, you know, this text I think is going to be really iconic. It's going to be, you know, it's a trade press, so it can be, you know, accessible the way that we, you know, we can have a separate conversation about access and scholarly knowledge, but because I think everything she's written has been quite accessible and necessary. But with this, it'll be open to a range of people who might ask a question still about, you know, where Black people come from, or, you know, what is the relationship between people of African descent and Europe? Are they separate, or how do they come together in a way that's not just colonial? But underneath there is, you know, as we already talked about, the Sinai women, the Kandakis, the Ga women, even more into the contemporary Italian woman with veils and afros, right, citing that text. Even in thinking about, you know, even in naming, what is also a lesser known history of Alessandro de' Medici's abuse allegations, right? We often don't hear these things. The women are, you know, castigated and cast out and like thrown under the sort of morass of history, so that we can have this sort of a site of Black excellence, if you want to call it that, from this very contemporary term. And also, you know, exceptionalism also works to undermine, you know, women and other minoritized figures throughout history as well. And so this text really meets a few of the others that of the very, very few others that we have, actually, that talk to us with this wide historical breadth, but also deepens its sort of political investment in the multiple underneaths that occur throughout time and history, which is to say, we also understand that there are like the Ga women in Ghana and their sites of encounter, but also not as contact, right? Not in this sort of anthropological, pre-civilized, civilized way, right? Acknowledges the kingdoms that exist, and rather talks to us about it as a circulation of power, and how we can like think through with a gendered analysis or assessment, these different negotiations, as they were negotiations in the etymological and political sense. My last question. These are all comments, but the last thing I did want to talk to us about, you know, really modeling the refractive reading that you've done throughout this text, is to take us back to the beginning. In your acknowledgements, or in the very introduction of the US version that I have, you also, and today you mention the police murder of George Floyd. And so perhaps just by way of connecting my different comments here, when you also talk about the untold history, and the questions that I was asking really were about the sort of like swath and the racial geographies that sort of get taken up, political geographies that you trace. But I'm also wondering if you have any thoughts about how that works in our contemporary moment, such as, you know, we have this galvanizing global moment of the police murder of George Floyd, but, you know, if you had, for example, mentioned Rashawn Charles or Sarah Reid or Sean Rigg, or these people from the United Kingdom who were also murdered by police, what would that have done in terms of tracing or expanding the geographies and showing us how these things connect, right? So you started us off by talking about police brutality, or like naming that and like deepening that from your talk. And I actually, yeah, it feels to me that it could perhaps go full circle so that we can think about other sites of untelling and how your book gets us to sort of take a breath, take a pause, and really deepen our assessment of the rich histories that we have on the European and African continents. Thank you so much for letting me talk with you today. I know that was a lot.
Thank you ever so much. Professor Kane Hart, do you want me to answer?
That's such a wonderful, rich set of questions for discussion. I'm wondering if we should first go to Professor Thomas for some comments and then return to a three-way conversation for the questions.
Okay.
For that?
Yeah, that works, but I don't want to forget. So exceptionalism, untold history, why not contemporary, why, you know, George Floyd, and why not the others? But for me, it's linked to the untold and the question of erasure, how it works at different levels. So I don't want to forget. Just remind me this, okay?
Sounds great. we can come back with even more questions at the end as well. So Professor Thomas, let me turn over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I promise to not be too long. I wanted to thank you, Professor Hart, for organizing this wonderful event, and all the staff at the International Institute and the Center for European and Russian Studies. It's such an honor for me to be able to even participate in this conversation with Professor Otele and Professor Smythe. I always learn so much from reading your work and from listening to you. And so I hope to just contribute a few suggestions, comments, and so on that will hopefully shape the rest of the discussion today. The first thing I wanted to say is to really sort of highlight the importance of this work. And for me, the key aspect of it is that most of the discussions that take place dealing with ethnic minorities, Africans in Europe, racial questions, and so on, tend to be post-colonial or post-migratory discussions. In other words, they focus almost exclusively on the 20th or the late 20th century. And what's so incredibly important about this work in providing this incredibly long and comprehensive history and overview of these questions is it actually goes about dismantling and forces us to rethink the history of Europe itself and the specific links and interconnections between Europe as space, between the continent of Africa, and the various ways in which these two histories are interconnected and imbricated. And it's impossible to have a conversation about the contemporary without improving our understanding of this legacy. And the ways in which I see this play out in the contemporary context, which I would love to hear Professor Otele talk a little bit more about, are organized around a few set of questions. So on the one hand, we've got this other space known as the European Union. And the European Union has been embroiled for at least the past decade on a whole range of questions that have to do with belonging. And in many ways, you could say that if there's anything the European Union has not done well, it is to sort of enlist people in kind of building and coalescing around this identity as to what it would mean to be European. And yet we have in these fascinating categories of the African European, the Afropean, the Afro-European, this broader transnational identification that takes place around a historical and a racial marker that have allowed populations through common histories, common experiences of discrimination within Europe and elsewhere to build and consolidate these identities. So I'm really interested in thinking a little bit more about that. I'm also interested in this kind of paradox of Brexit, which is to me the sort of the lifting up of the drawbridge on this history, while at the same time you hear the government reaffirming this sort of global Britain, global history, and the extent to which populations having identified in the UK as being African European find the European part amputated, cut off, because of the Brexit dynamic. And these questions also fit into the discussion that you made, or the comments that you made about Bath. And I'd also love to hear you talk more about the city in which you work, the university in which you work, and the various debates and polemics around monuments, museums, statues in that particular history, and how those debates have played out in that context, and how they relate to the work that you have been doing. And I'm also interested, as Professor Smythe underscored, is the sort of the proliferation of these different terms and what they potentially mean, and how useful or not useful you find them, such as Afropean, Afro-European, and the use of the hybrid here. And finally, how these different categories, so for example, it is very different being or claiming to be Afro-French because of the particularities of the colonial experience, but also the specificities of the French Republic, the ideals of universalism and so on, and how being Afro-British is different, Afro-Swedish, Afro-Flemish, Belgian, and so on, and how those various, what you might call hyphenated identities play out for you, and why the term, why the category African European can be useful for you. So many of these questions connect with what Professor Smythe has already outlined as sort of areas in which we could further look into this book. But as I said at the beginning, what I find so important, so crucially important about this work is this longer history. And if I could just jump to one quick section at the beginning of your book, as a way to kind of open up this discussion. And it very much connects with the context in which we're talking around institutions, around universities, and around the ways in which we are trying to change the curriculum and the institutional frameworks in which we are working. And you say, or you write, the mass demonstrations led by the Black Lives Matter and consequent debates about racism have highlighted both the need to expand knowledge about the histories of people of African descent and the urgency with which we must revise the teaching of colonial history in the global North. And so I'd love to hear you talk about strategies, tools, and ways in which we can further think about these absolutely crucial questions that now define our positions and roles in the various institutions that we work in. And so I just, once again, thank you for this incredible book. And it's such an honor to be with you today on this virtual panel talking about these important questions. So thank you.
Thank you ever so much. It's always a bit odd for me because there are several Olivettes in me, and there's the Olivette the scholar who gladly say, oh yeah, in honor, me too, yeah. And there's the Olivette who see a sense of urgency and who's a bit, who's thinking, we're not done yet. We have so much to do. We're scratching the surface, and let's not get carried away. And who therefore has a hard time accepting the congratulations. But I'm going to just put her to sleep for now and just to bask into your, your compliments. Okay, so the questions. Teaching, it's funny you should say that, because right before this talk, I had a meeting with the university. So the university was, it was about anti-racism and the ways in which we are fighting against racism and oppression and addressing the legacies of the past. And I don't want to celebrate University of Bristol. There are many things that are wrong about that university. What I do want to say is that through the push of the city, grassroots organization, students and staff, something incredible is happening in that city, and the university has understood that it cannot avoid being part of this. So the talk basically that I gave was one of the strands is the renaming of buildings at the moment. You will hear more about it on the news, but it's about renaming certain buildings that have the names of slave traders. And the idea is, for me, was to explain to them that it's not just about changing the name on the building. It's about what that building and that name, when it was chosen, meant. And it's about the people who allow that to happen. Because we have the big names, but behind the big names, you have hundreds of people who benefited from transatlantic enslavement and who supported that and who are not, pinpoint and who are not held accountable. But it's not so much about holding them accountable. It is about where the money went. It is about what do you do now to live together. So it was about, for me, teaching was part of it. Decolonizing the curriculum, of course, we understand that it's about unpacking, it's about adding, it's about enhancing, it's about challenging certain canons and so on and so forth. But for me, fundamentally, as a teacher, it means inclusive teaching. It means including the stories of people from various communities and allow them to exist into academia. It's bringing the expertise of grassroots organization, community leaders, people of African descent, and so on and so forth, bringing them into academia so that they teach us how they have been able to survive for so many centuries. Because it takes skills to be able to transmit stories. It takes skills to be able to actually teach without using certain canons. We're teaching, we're being taught through food. We're being taught through music, cloth. We're being taught through silences. And those silences on the outskirts of certain hegemonic discourses are also teaching lessons for us. So that's what I was saying earlier to universities' gods, that decolonizing is much more than that, and renaming is not enough, and knowledge production, who gets to produce knowledge and who gets to share that knowledge, is incredibly important to me. I was taught by my grandmother. She wasn't an academic, and her stories have survived because she was taught by her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother. And those women were the victims of sexual violence from the German colonizers. So these stories have remained with us, and we have so much to learn. Now, the tools for teaching are equally important. Do we stay on our ivory tower, or do we actually physically move from those buildings to the communities that teach us? This is the next step. You can't just stay there or in museums. It's much more than that. So that's one thing. About Afro-Welsh, Afropeans, the terms mean different things to people who are using them. Johnny Pitt, whom I talked not a few days ago, actually, his trajectories is a certain outlook on Black Europe that is different from mine. And it means something for him to use the term African, and I respect that. And I think that we need to respect that by allowing them to exist. The plurality of terms is really related to the context and to the intellectual and emotional journey that we're all going through. So I have no problems with that. African Europeans in this book was an echo, a kind of me reaching out to the US. Me telling that African Americans are a lot wrong, but the basis of organization, the coming together, the history of African Americans have taught me so much as an African European that it's almost an homage for me that I'm paying, because I want to use those two terms together because they mean something. They mean struggle and they mean liberation. That is not over, it's ongoing. But why can't we come together? Hence the idea of transnationality, transnationalism. That is incredibly important and that I mentioned in the book. And it's one of the questions that came out about that. Transnational identities are complexly beautiful. So Brexit arrives, and Brexit, we're taught to vote for Brexit and so on. And, well, the British are taught to vote for Brexit and so on and so forth. And you know what? The numbers came, and people of African descent are the ones, they do not vote for Brexit. They were told by Brexiteers that if they voted for Brexit, then more resources would be dedicated to the Caribbean, to Africans, and therefore, so they didn't believe that. What they did know, did understand, was that it was something that exists outside the grand narratives, that is communities of people of African descent in Europe, and the only way forward was to reach out to them. And I'm glad about that. But cutting off that and cutting from Europe, of course, has many flaws, as you mentioned, and as I say in the book, but transnationalism, transnational identities and organization and organizing rather will still exist whether there's Brexit or not, because people of African descent have been organizing for centuries anyway. So they don't necessarily need the European Union for that. But it would have been, make things easier. Another point that is about Bath, Bristol. Yes, a lot. That would be like a whole talk. A lot, so much is happening. Like every day, I'm exhausted. Every day something's happening. So we had the toppling of the statues, but that was very specific. It's provoked a debate about statues and monuments, of course, in the UK, and imperial nostalgia and all the rest of it. But at Bristol level, so many things are happening, because the Bristol example is really what happens after discussions have reached an impact. Discussions have been taking place about that statue for decades, and young people just decided to do it. And these young people, as some of you have seen, they're not necessarily racialized as Black. In fact, a lot of them were of dual heritage and white. What does it tell us about contemporary Britain? A narrative that you don't see, a narrative that is not actually shared, which is a multicultural understanding of fight and liberation. And for me, it's incredibly important. I see it through my students, wealthy students, going to communities and working with communities, or at least trying with, there are limitations to that. They come with their background, class and race and gender, but a lot of them are trying and are getting involved into this. And the turning point was when those students decided to ask the university to address the question of renaming, to address the question of racism, to address the question of the lack of Black professors, hence university running and trying to snatch me from University of Bristol so that I can work there, because of the students who were demanding this. So a lot is happening. Now, going back to your questions, Professor Smythe. Okay, so exceptionalism is something that I'm really glad, I've wrestled with it throughout this. The archives are forcing me to use exceptional, but I was resisting it so much. And the ways in which I try to use those who are not exceptional, but who constructed the narrative, was through, for example, legal cases. I talked about Elias Burgos, who was a slave trader who bring Juliana to the Netherlands and tries to force her to go back to the Caribbean, because once in the Netherlands, she was free. This is an unknown person. We don't even know what happened. But for me, that shows me that there were so much resistance against the law, against the policing of Black body, that much more than we know of. We have another example, policing of Black body, La Police des Noirs, the police for Black people, 1770, 76. What happens is these populations, Black people are people of African descent, Caribbean descent, they're forced to carry a cartouche if they were to circulate in France, cartouche, which is a form of identification, and which is already racial profiling as we see it today. And cartouche, but for masters who bring them from the Caribbean, it's a problem, because then who's going to serve them? Who's going to wait upon them? And these populations who are coming from the Caribbean are put in detention centers. That would be the term today, detention centers. So it's not a new phenomenon. Worse than that, detention centers, people are finding means, or masters are finding means to remove them from those centers, simply because, for example, for those who are wet nurses, what happens? So a lot of things were happening under the radar for people who were not exceptional, who actually force the law to either harden or loosen at will. And I was fascinated by these stories and how they contrast with the exceptional, because the exceptional means there's only a few of us, and therefore, if there's only a few of us, it means the rest of you, or you lot, as the British would say, you lot cannot do that. It means that there are only a few of you who are intelligent enough to achieve that, which is completely, what's the term, the polite term, ridiculous. So, Untold story. For me, it was interesting as well, because the publisher came with Untold, and I'm like, no, I just explained in the book proposal that these stories were known by my grandmother and by other people, so they're not untold from us. And yet you want me to untold for marketing reason. Okay, I'm going to run with it, because this is actually about question of erasure and memory and memorialization. erasure from national narratives, but known by others. So that erasure allowed me to talk about resistance and what is taught on the margins and what is shared on the margins. And yet again, that allows me to talk about the stories of liberation. And yeah, that's, oh, there was another question, but I forgot. I don't remember, sorry.
I can intervene for a moment with a question from one of the attendees. There are many other questions I think we can return to as well from both Essay and Dominic's comments, but let me contribute something from the audience. So there's a thank you all to presenters for a wonderful discussion. History is complex indeed. I'm also wondering if you can share some thoughts or how we can reconcile the analysis of Ethiopian empresses resisting European colonialism as early examples of Black feminism with the histories of violent and brutal processes of Abyssinian colonialism, including enslavement of some of the conquered nations and nationalities, such as the Oromo people, the Harari people, Sidama people, and so on, by these same emperors and empresses as part of the unification and consolidation of power in the Abyssinian Empire. Legacies of that violence, including the contested legacies of the emperors and empresses, is an ongoing source of tension in present-day Ethiopia.
Yes, certainly. As the person who asked the question mentioned, history is complex and all these are not mutually exclusive, okay? So while this was happening, enslavement was happening. While people in the Caribbean were fighting against oppression, somebody that I didn't detail in the book that I called Nathaniel Wells, who was the first Black sheriff of dual heritage, his mother was, he became, at the age of 15, what would be nowadays a multimillionaire because his father was a slave trader. He freed or manumitted his mother, and his mother went on to buy enslaved people. So these stories are not mutually exclusive, and this is how they coexist. Does it mean that they were not early example of Black feminism? No, they're still example of Black feminism, but they were also oppressive women because they were in a situation where they wanted power at all costs. So, yeah.
Thank you. There's a question about Basil Davidson and his books and in films that talk about Africa's relationship with Europe and whether or not you have comments on his work.
A long time ago, I read his book when I was a PhD student, and what I took from it was that some of the analysis for me was based on archival material that hadn't been used before. So I salute his work, but other pieces for me were not relevant in terms of the analysis of the enslaved. The voices of the enslaved, they didn't exist so much in his work. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that as such, but as a person of African descent, I thought you would need a broader view of that history.
There's also a question from a participant about Beethoven. And I find this interesting because it sort of returns to this question that you pose about the interplay in the reception of in the sort of categories that you're talking about the interplay between the the level of the skin and interpretations that come immediately from that, as opposed to other the question about dual heritage and so on. And so I wonder if you could just make a comment about the general idea of Beethoven in relationship to being thought of as Black.
Oh, I don't know about Beethoven and this idea of being Black. It's not even something that I contemplated, because I just thought that it leads us to a path of, does it matter if it was Black? I mean, what does it say? Why is it important? The flip side of that question is, it does matter then the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who was indeed Black, was forgotten. So I'm much more interested in the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, Joseph Boulogne, and his music, and Mozart's reaction to him, because Mozart refused to meet him. However, Handel met him and, as I said, commissioned his work, rather than was Beethoven Black or not Black, because it didn't prevent his music from being known.
Thank you very much for that answer. I wonder if just to return for a second to some of the questions from our commentators. Dominic's question about the effort in Europe to build or find a European identity, and the relation, the contribution of your work, interestingly, to that question about building a European identity. The individuals whom you describe in forging their own lives seemed to, in a sense, build a European identity. And I'm wondering what reflections you might have on the way in which that question is posed in the European Union, and also how one might actually think about it completely differently on the basis of your work.
That's interesting. I don't know the impact, if my work will have an impact, and that's not. What is interesting for me is this idea of a European identity that is almost monocultural and based essentially a lot around what they called native European. If you listen to identitarians, and many people are sharing their views, the identitarians are the ones that are stopping vessels on the Mediterranean because the fortress of Europe needs to be protected. There's this idea that you have European natives who need to be protected from the invasion, and therefore that implies that there's one monoculture, which is completely untrue historically and at the current moment. So that's why I'm saying nostalgia of an empire that was already imagined. It's like Imagined Community 2.0. And I really think that this is a futile effort. They have the means to do that. They have the laws, and we see a rise in far right. But I also believe deeply in my heart, and that might be naive, is that if people of African descent have survived all these stuff since the 3rd century, I don't see how we won't survive this either. So try.
Dominic, yes.
Yes, if I could just add on one thing. I think that one of the fascinating, that the book has been written, it's sealed in these 2 beautiful covers, one in the US edition, one in the UK edition. The journey I'm excited about at this stage is the process of translation, and not just into other languages, but into other, discursive spaces. So I'm going to be interested to see more how this book gets read once it's translated into French, but also when it's read in the academy, in Denmark, in Germany, in Italy, and the various ways in which different elements of the book will appeal to different components of these debates. Because there's, of course, the Venn diagram as to how the Afro component is articulated in these different national spaces, but it's also interested to look at the particular histories, legacies, far-right policies and so on, and how they're working out in those individual spaces. So I think the journey has really just begun in terms of the book, and it's hopefully an exciting one. Yes,
I hope so too, because the translation is happening as we speak, and the book will be out in 2022, and it's being and I'm having conversation with the translator about certain words that the French don't have. And I'm finding hard even to find the words for them, even though in French, because it's so the culture and the colonial legacies and the colonial mentality so imbued into certain words that it's hard. In Germany as well next year. And in academia, it's going to be another discussion because, well, academia and Ivory Tower have got their own vision of what constitutes a scholarship and so on and so forth. So I'm in advance, I'm a bit amused because it's a provocation, this book, and I'm enjoying how people are reacting. It triggered certain strong reactions. They're not positive, but it's amusing.
I think that returns us a little bit more to a question that Essay posed about those reactions. And it also strikes me that one of the things that is significant at the moment is turning the lens a little bit away from the US as the paradigm of these movements. And as Essay mentioned, there are other incidents of police brutality in other places that, and if the Black Lives Matter movement was a galvanizing movement, it was not the only, it was not the beginning of movements elsewhere. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit more both about the reception and reaction to the book, and also about this kind of question of the sort of US centrism of some of the conversations.
It's interesting, yes. The reaction to the book for me, again, it was a lot. I give a lot of names for Black British people, prominent ones, and I keep forgetting and I keep apologizing to them because I didn't put them in this book, because it's saying some people's names. It's saying them as they contribute in various ways to building that story and narrative of liberation. And I can't go into details. So that's one thing. The other thing is about police brutality. Why do I speak about the US and George Floyd? Simply because that conversation about UK police brutality, French police brutality, has taken on a new turn because of that demonstration. These are stories. We know what has been happening for decades now in terms of racial profiling, police brutality in those countries. But the demonstration, the enough is enough, triggered something that is more to do with people who are not at all involved in this, who suddenly realized that, hang on a minute, we have a problem as, for example, British, multicultural, cultural diversity, we too have that problem. But we thought these were isolated incidents. No, that has allowed a dialogue to actually open the Pandora's box that some people were refusing to look or actually didn't know because they're in various circles. And it is an important moment because that there's no, almost every other week now we have details about police brutality on the news, on the BBC, Guardian, and so on and so forth. We have news about trials as we speak. One of my friends is representing one of those people. We have the news, whereas before they were not even mentioned. You have to, dig deep and fight people to have them mentioned in the media. So I think it was a turning point for me, and I wanted to mark that. And I also wanted to nudge the Americans to kind of see the impact they had on Europe, but also invite them to look at the fact that there's power in numbers. The US people of African descent in Europe and American descent in Europe are very well organized, but there's even more power in reaching out to European communities and grassroots organizations in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Britain and France, and so on and so forth. So there's never too many.
Thank you. We do have a couple of more questions from the participants. The continued erasure of African histories in Britain and beyond is now seemingly being welcomed by the Academy, or at least in part. Is this work possible without African descended people doing it? What other questions are contemporary scholars of African descent asking that would otherwise be muted, maligned, or ignored? And are Black questions seen as biased if the scholar is identified as such?
That's an interesting question. That's the story of my life. You're biased because you're Black. Even today, in that earlier meeting where I was basically challenged on when I was giving information about the Wells family, who are the founding fathers of the university. This is scholarship, this is archival research. And yet it was a challenging question about, I'm not a historian, but I know that this and this. So we still have those reactions, and we still have that. But I do believe that anybody can do the research about the history of people of African descent, and I am completely in favor of that. But we do have a problem in Britain when those stories are only done by white scholars, and the numbers are there to prove it. So we have a flurry of posts in recent months, even 1 year, that have been put in place and that are about hiring a Black professor, a Black lecturer, and all the rest of it. But it's very, very, it's not about hiring a Black professor. The posts are usually about teaching Black British history, research Black British history, but they're not ring-fenced for people of African descent. which means that we still have a problem and there's still resistance in the hiring process. I do believe that who gets to tell the story matters. And we need to do that. And Britain is so far from doing it and is still resisting as we speak. That this is an uphill battle, and I can't. Being in these spaces on my own is painful. But there are so many barriers that even opening the door to others to get in is almost impossible. And I can't do it on my own, and we need allies for that. So that's why we need to come together to fight this. Thank you so much. We have time for just one more question, and it's a very interesting one. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I'm wondering about the identification question and the specificity of European components as opposed to the African component. That is, what about being Cameroonian British or Cameroonian European rather than Afro-European? I ask in part because of the problem of making Africa monolithic as part of the diminishing of the diversity of the continent. Oh, that's another interesting one, because I talked about entities and the way those identifications are represented across the European continent. So it's not just about Europe. So it's not just about Africa. I talked about Libyans, but I talked about Ethiopians, but I talked about Egyptians. I'm Cameroonian French, so I can be specific. My children are Cameroonian, French, German, Welsh, Finnish. So it's, you know, all these things matter, and I can get really specific in another book perhaps, but I can get really specific. So there's no monolithic about individual experiences, as I indeed try to show, I hope, in my book.
Yeah, can I add? I also think we had a brief conversation about this at the start with the different geographies that we can sort of we can name, and I also look forward to Professor Otele's next book about these nuances. But what's also really sort of important is not to sort of I think it's never really useful perhaps to sort of do a reversal of perceived asymmetries, right? And so if Europe seems to be hailed then and is not seeming like a monolith, then we don't need to do the same for Africa, which makes sense because there is this sort of, I mean, there's, you know, websites and texts talking about Africa is a country or Africa is not a country because it gets hailed this way in this historical sense. But actually there is a like political potential that I think what this book does offer by talking about Libyans, Ethiopians, you know, Italians, but not just Italians, but Romans, and then obviously the Romans from the Holy Roman Empire, is actually thinking about power relations, which I don't want us to lose sight of, right? I mean, the text does start with with a citation from Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, which is like 500 pages, very specifically talking about, you know, the Gauls and then so it does get quite specific, but we do well to sort of understand that the relationality between, you know, the world between African and European actually portends a lot for us, and that doesn't preclude, as Professor Otele is saying, the geospecificity, the ethno-racial specificity of individual experiences, but we actually maybe need to attend more to the presences of African people and European people together throughout history.
Thank you.
Beautifully said. Dominic, do you have any further concluding comments? We have just a minute or two.
Thank you again for letting me participate here. It was a wonderful event. I really want to thank Professor Otele for coming to UCLA to meet with us. And I look forward to more discussions, especially having discussions across the channel, the Atlantic in France, when the book comes out there. I'm really excited and eager to see how it's received there with all the debates, polemics, and so on. So just the first of many conversations, I hope, and thank you.
Thank you ever so much. Please, Professor Smythe and Thomas, when you do come, you know, let me know. We can go to the pub or something.
I'm going back home in a few months. I'll see you there.
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone, Professor Otele, Thomas, Smythe, for such a fantastic presentation and conversation, and for being here to wrap up our year of talks in the International Institute, and to thank everyone who's participated and the wonderful audiences, and hope that, as Professor Thomas said, the conversation can continue. This has been so important for us. Thank you so much, Professor Otele. And thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.